Hi there. Surprisingly, an article on the private sector's role in China's economy has triggered heated discussions in China. It raised people's anxiety about whether it is hinting at new policy orientations and ideas. Through decades of economic transformation, the private sector, the private economy, has become an important part of China's economy and contributed a lot in economic transformation, technological innovation, and employment. And now, when China embarks on a new phase of economic reforms and opening up, how do we assess the private economy's role in China? What are the challenges and opportunities facing the private economy, and why would people be anxious about the context of this article? To discuss these issues and more, I'm very happy to be joined by Charles Liu, the founder of How Capital, and Rick Dunham, a visiting scholar with Tsinghua University. We shall also cross over to Hong Hao, a chief strategist from the Bank of Communications International, via satellite. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. But before we get started, let's look at this.
Recently, an article went viral on the internet, arousing people's anxiety and triggering heated discussions. In the article, the author said that the private sector has completed its task of assisting the development of the public economy and therefore should gradually exit the economy. The private economy should not continue to expand blindly. A new form, more centralized, more united, and more large-scale and mixed public and private economy will probably take a larger proportion in the new development of the socialist market. If we fail to concentrate our national power, completely following the path of economic liberalization, China's economic and social reform and opening up will face unimaginable pressure and resistance. The advantages and achievements already achieved may also be gradually lost. And according to Yao Yang, director of the National Development Research Institute of Peking University, China's economy benefited a lot from the reform of state-owned enterprises in the 90s, but marketization of these state-owned enterprises is not enough. With state-owned enterprises carrying out reverse restructuring when the private enterprises are facing a difficult time will have a negative impact on the confidence of private enterprises. Also on August 20th, Chinese Vice Premier Liu He presided over the first meeting of the State Council promoting the development of small and medium-sized enterprises, saying that the private enterprises contributed to more than 50% of the total tax revenue and 60% of the GDP. The government should adhere to the basic economic system, giving equal treatment to both state-owned and private economies.
Welcome to our discussion here, gentlemen. 2018 is an important year for the Chinese economy, not only because of the 40th anniversary of China's opening up, but also this is the 10th anniversary of the 2008 financial tsunami. We have a lot to do, obviously, in our policy debates. Interesting enough, this article that went viral on the internet talked about the role of the non-public sector of the Chinese economy, the private economy. He says a lot of people got scared that it is time for the non-public sector to beat a retreat from the center stage of the Chinese economy. What do you think of this? Are we going to go back to 20 years ago? Because it's in 1997, for the first time in the official statement of the CCP, that the non-public sector was regarded very seriously as an important part of the Chinese economy, other than the state-owned enterprises. Are we really going back to 20 years ago?
No.
Absolutely
Absolutely and categorically no. I think academics like Mr. Wu, who wrote the article, tend to not really understand how the economy works. And their understanding of the economy is much more based on theories of left or right, free market or planned, and socialist and so on. China has taken a very different path from any other country. It had to, because of its size and the difficulties that it confronted. To have achieved what it's achieved, to go from $1 GDP above, per capita GDP above India, to 500% of the per capita of India is a significant achievement. And to take 600 million people out of poverty is a significant achievement. But this is done the Chinese way. I think it involves culture, it involves societal norms, it involves, people used to talk about guanxi, talk about all kinds of
And
other
of course,
things.
entrepreneurship and diligence of the Chinese.
Absolutely hardworking, diligence. The entrepreneurship can have positive and negative sides. Sometimes a little too entrepreneurial, like innovative finance, P2P, peer-to-peer lending, shadow banking, trusts, and so on, has brought about.
And give no regard to the environmental conditions.
Exactly.
In Africa, for example, we came under fire.
Yeah, I think overwhelming entrepreneurship without regard to regulatory requirements is dangerous. That side should really be, I think, more strictly or more vehemently regulated.
Now, Rick, what are your thoughts on the alleged endgame of the Chinese economic miracles 40 years after we started to open the economy up?
Well, I think talk of an end game is wrong both ways. I've heard it. The end game that it's time to wrap up the private sector and move back toward more state control doesn't seem to be going anywhere in an era where innovation and technology are so important. And I also think the thought of the end game that China's economy is going to collapse and China will go back to second-tier economic status. I don't think that that's true either.
But for decades, we've been discussed as something like we're going to collapse.
Right,
pretty
exactly.
soon. Every day, every month, every passing year, they're going to always a strong voice in the West, so critical of the Chinese economic development path or roadmap of the Chinese navigation of our own growth.
Right.
Why do we have this critical voice?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. Ever since the opening up, there have been books, there have been articles. I've been in China at Tsinghua University for 5 years. Every year I see stories predicting the coming collapse of the Chinese economy. It hasn't happened. However, there are unique challenges at this time that both the government and the private sector need to deal with. Internal problems and external problems caused by rising nationalism globally and Donald Trump specifically.
And particularly the Trump administration threatens to withdraw from the WTO, where they thought that there shouldn't be a consensus about the differences between developed and developing countries, and China, of course, should be a developed one. Now let's cross over to our economist in Hong Kong, Mr. Hong Hao, Chief Strategist from the Bank of Communications, for his comment. Hello, Mr. Hong.
Hi there.
We're talking about the role of the private economy. Now, it seems there is a strong sense of anxiety, and this sense is growing fast, pervading every aspect of society as to the prospect of the Chinese economy. What do you think of this current debate?
Yeah, well, I think it was set off by an article on the internet. I mean, these days, one cannot underestimate the power of the new media. Now, I think the problem is that, since the beginning of this year, private enterprise is really struggling. If you talk to some private company owners, they will tell you that tax burden is very high, social security burdens for their employees are very high. But this year, because of trade war and the multiple other factors, sales and earnings are not going up. So you can see from the official numbers, there's a great divide between how well the SOEs and bigger national firms are doing and how poorly the private enterprises are performing. And especially since the increase of tax burden or the change of tax law, many of them probably finding it a little difficult to evade tax burden. So as a result, cost of doing business has increased substantially for those businesses, and many of them unfortunately are considering closing. And I think because of this background, in this backdrop, in the internet article that you mentioned, really create a lot of anxieties.
Charles, vulnerabilities of the private economy aside, let's take a closer look at the SOE. Now, Professor Yao Yang, a senior economist from Peking University, said recently it is a rather inefficient marketization of the state-owned enterprises that should have captured more headlines instead of the non-public sector. So what do you think of his concerns?
I think his concerns are correct. The dominance of state-owned enterprises in a number of sectors, and increasingly even more sectors, is a scary thing. State-owned enterprises are less efficient, they're a lot less market-driven, and they have political objectives more than market objectives. So they may not operate to the best of the overall value to the society.
But surprisingly and ironically, Charles, the SOE would find it a lot easier to have the loans. Financing vehicles are never a problem for them, despite the poor efficiency of the SOEs.
SOEs usually don't go into bankruptcy. Private companies go into bankruptcy.
Because they enjoy the strong backing of the government.
That's right. You have to look at what the Chinese banks have learned. The first thing they learned from Western banks is risk avoidance. When you give out a loan, you basically have to look at your bad debt risk, and you don't worry too much when it's a major SOE, especially the top 500, but you would be concerned with small, medium-sized companies.
But why the golden principle of risk avoidance regarding the reputation of the non-public sector risk?
I think they learned a lot from the global financial collapse of 10 years ago, particularly in the United States, where losses were socialized. The government bailed out the big banks, and I think that in China, what was seen was state-owned enterprises could be bailed out. The government would socialize the losses, but in the private sector, it's not that case. And so it's much riskier to give money because you might lose the money that you're lending, while if you loan to the SOEs, the government will back them up in case of collapse or in case of loss.
Let me go back to Mr. Hong. Given the adversity of the downward pressure, and particularly immense pressure of taxation, financing vehicles for the private economy, are you confident that the small and medium-sized enterprises will be able to survive the current crisis, a crisis of confidence?
Yeah, I think that would be a better way to put it. You know, this crisis of confidence. We're not seeing in the official numbers tremendous slowdown and tremendous weakness in the Chinese economy. I think, you know, if you look at the PMI numbers, especially the new order numbers and the inventory numbers, if you look at the VAI and the industrial output numbers, you know, many of those numbers actually confirm a gradual slowdown rather than a sharp slowdown in the economy. And I think, you know, people having this perception of crisis is because the stock market was down quite a bit. But, you know, keep in mind that the rest of the emerging market is down more than 20% as well. So the Shanghai Composite didn't substantially underperform the other parts of the emerging market, especially in the Asian regions. So I would say that, you know, it is indeed a crisis in confidence. I think, you know, many of the private enterprises are somehow struggling a little bit, you know, because of the lack of access to proper funding. But then at the same time, you know, we've been through 2008, you know, we've been through 2011, 2012. Back then, the debt burden and the crisis that we're facing was substantially more significant than, you know, the current slowdown that we're facing.
Charles, I wonder if we have constitutional guarantees for the safety of the private assets. Now, a lot of the fears coming from segments of the private economy come from their ill feeling that there are no efficient legal measures to protect the assets of the self-employed and individual enterprises of the non-public sector.
Well, I think there are two aspects to this. In terms of what you were talking about as well, in terms of the risks that we see in the Chinese economy. One aspect is, okay, it's guaranteed by the Constitution, but the implementation side sometimes may not be strict or strictly followed. There are shortcomings in the protection. But on the other hand, there is another lack of confidence and fear from entrepreneurs, because many of them have adopted methods to tax avoidance or other gray area activities which potentially could be seen as the original sin that potentially they could be caught up for. Now, in fact, right now, you know, there, in terms of yin-yang contracts, that's
in the showbiz.
Yeah, well, that's all over the place. It's not just in the media sector, right? It's in many, many other sectors. If you've executed a yin-yang contract, does that mean potentially you could be up for grabs as well, even for somebody normal, you know, not a movie star? So I think there are two sides to this. One is the government implementation of protection is a little risky, but it's a little, leaves something to be desired. But the other part is too many entrepreneurs have found 上有政策下有对策 ways of addressing policy regulations.
Taking advantage of the loopholes.
Exactly. And there will be some risks there for them as well.
But no one would believe that entrepreneurs of the small and medium-sized enterprises are angels. They are sinned one way or another, given the adversity of the circumstances, because the political institutions seem not to favor the existence and prosperity of SMEs. So what do you think of the vulnerabilities?
Well, I think there's a basic vulnerability to a market system. Entrepreneurs are always risk takers, and it's risky. Small businesses are risky. Many of them fail, and that's something that has not been really characteristic of the Chinese economy in the modern era. And I think that you're going to see some businesses fail because they are not protected by the government. There is no guarantee that you will make money, and there are cycles. But I think what's really helping the Chinese economy now is that there still remains consumer confidence. People are still buying things. There still is demand. It has not slowed down very much. It continues to grow. But I think that there are a lot of risks taken, and I do think stricter government enforcement, closing of loopholes, is going to hurt a lot of companies. But then again, you could argue they should be hurt if they were playing fast and loose with the rules.
Yes, indeed. There have been arguments and debates as to something might go wrong with the current high-handed crackdown on P2P, because previously small and medium-sized enterprises and private investors took advantage of the vagueness, ambiguity of the policy execution. Now this time around, the government wants really to clarify and to clear up the messy situation. Now let me go back to Mr. Hong Hao for his analysis on, for example, the issue of the code of conduct for the non-public sector. Do you think they take much of the blame for tax evasion? What do you think of the resilience of the non-public sector regarding innovation, to which the non-public sector contributes 70%? They also account for 80% of the employment in the job market.
Yeah, I think, well, because of the nature of the smaller businesses, they're primarily in service industry, and I think that is the reason. It tend to be more labor intensive, and I think that's the reason why they provide a lot more jobs than the other enterprises. You know, I think, you know, to say which sector is stronger than the other is probably the wrong way to look at it. I would say that, you know, some of the sectors are actually more suitable for a high market concentration. You know, for example, some upstream resource sectors. You know, you actually need economics of scale to explore mines, you know, to make steels and all that. You know, so some upstream sectors is actually the strengths of many of the SOEs and national firms. But then, you know, once you go downstream, especially when you go into the retail sector, the healthcare sector, education and all that, you know, quickly then you discover smaller firms, smaller size firms are actually more nimble, more suitable for those sectors. So I would say that, you know, when we talk about, you know, which sectors are stronger, you know, we really need to look into the nature of the sectors that they're engaged in. And also beyond that, you know, in terms of tax evasion, I would say, you know, tax evasion exists in many industries across the board, even in foreign countries. For example, some of the great American companies put tax shelters in Ireland, so that they don't have to pay the American tax. And now that Donald Trump is actually cutting tax to attract those overseas cash to come back. So I wouldn't be too surprised to see right here in China, because of the number of loopholes in the existing tax code, smaller companies found it probably profitable to be engaged in that kind of behavior. But then as a result, the plus side of it is that, for the past couple of years, because of the tax evasion, they did manage to survive and provide jobs for many other people. So I think there are plus and minus to the existing systems. And so now that we're trying to plug the loophole, but then at the same time we're trying to lower the tax burden for small enterprises. So there are things that we're trying to re-engineer the system. It takes time for people to get used to it, but then during the process, inevitably there could be some sacrifices, but that's the cost that we have to pay to restructure the system to a more open, fairer system.
Yes, indeed, the government has to do a lot more to streamline the non-public sector and to let entrepreneurs of the non-public sector know that they got to comply with the laws. And having said this, what do you think of the prospects of the job market? Every time, without exceptions, in his work report at the opening session of the NPC plenary session, the Premier would always focus on the importance of employment. Every year we got an enormous number of up to 7 million to 10 million graduates from the universities and colleges in mainland China. Now that's a huge astronomical number. With the current adversity of the job market, Mr. Hong, are you confident that enough jobs would be created to soothe the fears of young university graduates so that we would avoid the risk of having social unrest?
Yes, I mean, the days that when we graduate from the university and then we get allocated a job by the supervisor, those days are gone. I still remember those days. So when you graduate, there's no pressure. But then I think now the nature of the job market has changed. Besides many of the great foreign enterprises that the graduates can work for, and also SOEs and national firms that graduates can work for. I would say that there are many other forms of employment and also many other forms of entrepreneurship that is bursting out of the body of the graduate students. So for example, a number of younger generation kids, they're engaged in internet media, internet promotion, and many other forms of small business that is related to the internet. And the internet is a great platform, especially for smaller business. And nowadays, even one can be quite successful, open up a WeChat shop on the WeChat platform. So there are many other things that people can do, and many of these forms of employment is sort of unthinkable during my days. People would say, those kind of jobs are sort of, they sort of dismiss them as a lower form of employment. But then nowadays, because of the wealth effect is being generated on the internet platform, is attracting more and more younger people to join and become an entrepreneur.
Well, I'm sorry, Mr. Hong, you might sound a little bit too optimistic about the prospects of creating jobs for startup companies. Charles and Rick, given the current lack of confidence, particularly international venture capitalists are withdrawing from the Chinese market, how could we expect them to create enough incubation for the brilliant minds that come from those who graduate from Stanford and who come from Silicon Valley? Because most of the people have been put on the blacklist of FBI, I mean the 1,000 people plan by the organizational department of the CPC Central Committee. Now these guys have to come home because they are not trusted by the US government, citing national security as the reason, if not it's a repeat of the Senator McCarthy's crackdown. So what do you think of the chance for startup companies to find their niche and to create enough jobs for
Well, actually, they're coming back to China, scientists, engineers coming back to China, is not a recent phenomenon, not because of President Trump. It's been happening very, very substantially over the last 5 to 6 years. Young people, educated, ambitious, enthusiastic, entrepreneurial, will go where the opportunities are. For example, the number of startups by Taiwanese in mainland China is 14 times that of startups by Taiwanese in Taiwan. Why? The opportunities are here, the market is here, the possibilities are here.
Are you talking about the possible and easier unification across the Taiwan Strait due to the emergence of high-tech sector?
Well, I hear there are over 170,000 Taiwanese engineers working in the Pearl River Delta alone. But I think, number one, young people, ambitious, want to do something, it's much easier for them to find a marketplace in China to do startup. Secondly, this is a fear, the vilification of China by the Trump administration. Unfortunately, it's not just the Trump administration, it's bipartisan now that they need to find an enemy in China as the enemy, and the Chinese are bad people, is making life more and more difficult for those who are living in the U.S.
Is that a self-fulfilling prophecy by the military-industrial complex, finding an external threat to justify the defense budget?
Absolutely, that's one part of it. But I think those who are flashing their muscles is more north of China than China itself.
Rick, very quickly, what do you think of the chance for young university graduates to find jobs very quickly, despite the adversity of the trade standoff?
I think it's a major challenge. I think that the people we're talking about can create entrepreneurial businesses, but it's the number of people who are just coming with college degrees whose parents may work in manufacturing, they want a professional job. Can China create that level of professional jobs? Not the people who are new entrepreneurs, but professional. I think that is a real challenge, and that's why innovation is so important, not to have the people who run those businesses, but the people who work for them. The educated people.
And what do you think of the opportunities of AI, big data, cloud computing, that kind of stuff have created a lot of headlines for the jobs that may be replaced by robots instead of human labor resources?
There is an element of really positive contribution to economy in terms of these things. These are things of the future. We talk about, for example, how the new iPhone, one chip can process signals at 12 billion times per second. These are technological advances which will enhance efficiency and so on. But I would like to talk about another thing for young people. There is a major shift in the economy from manufacturing to other things. In addition to this, what I've been shocked by is the amount of allocations of funding and support by major SOEs for ecological and environmental projects. Take, for example, the 100 billion that the Three Gorges Group is putting together for water remediation along the Yangtze River. Or the COFCO, again, 100 billion is put together for green agriculture to avoid overuse of chemical fertilizers. I mean, all these things are new things, which is contributing to society in a positive way, good energy. And these are things which young people really should get into.
Yes, indeed, the increase of service industry will help promote the employment for young people. That might be the silver lining of the darkest clouds. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.